Under a sky the color of pewter, Europe lay silent beneath its winter shroud. Snow pressed against the earth like a heavy memory, muting every sound except the crunch of boots and the slow, weary rhythm of breathing. Along the fences of a remote prisoner of war camp, frost gathered like lace on barbed wire, glimmering faintly when the wind stirred. Inside the wooden barracks, the air smelled of damp wool and smoke from stoves barely kept alive. The men inside, British guards and German prisoners alike, moved with the same tired caution, as if any sudden motion might wake the ghosts of those already lost. It was late 1916, and even victory, for either side, felt like a word from another lifetime. In that stillness, time thickened. Days did not pass, they hovered. The soldiers' uniforms, once proud and pressed, had turned to rags of mud and thread. A letter from home, a shared cigarette, a steaming bowl of soup, these were the fragments of humanity that survived the frost. Outside, the wind carried the distant toll of a church bell, muffled but persistent. It was a sound that could belong to any faith, any nation. In its echo, the lines between enemy and friend began to blur, even if no one dared say so aloud.
At night, when the lamps were dimmed and the camp lay in a hush of breath and snow, the men would listen to the creak of timber, the whisper of someone praying in another language, the faint murmur of life continuing despite it all. The cold was absolute, but within it, something warmer waited, an unspoken, fragile understanding that beneath the frost and the orders, they were all simply human, enduring the same endless winter together. The British officers carried themselves with a restraint that had nothing to do with pride, and everything to do with endurance. Their faces were lined not just by the cold, but by the quiet weight of command, the responsibility of holding order in a world that had long since abandoned reason. Each morning, they walked the perimeter with their collars turned up, boots pressing shallow prints into the snow, eyes steady but tired. They spoke little. Orders were given softly, not barked. There was no triumph in their tone, only necessity.
They had seen too much of what hatred did, how it hollowed men from the inside, turning purpose into cruelty. So they held themselves apart from it. Discipline was their armor, empathy their final act of rebellion. In the mess hall, they ate plain food beside a fading photograph of home. A child's face, a wife's letter tucked behind a cup. They were soldiers, yes, but also guardians of something more fragile, the belief that decency could survive even here. When they looked across the camp toward the prisoners, there was no contempt in their gaze, only a quiet acknowledgement, as if to say, "We are all tired, and we are all waiting for mercy to return." The German prisoners carried their silence like another uniform, fitted, familiar, and heavy with memory. They were not monsters, only men caught on the wrong side of history's tide. Behind the wire they moved with quiet precision, their routines almost monastic, folding blankets, mending torn gloves, writing letters that might never cross the sea.
When they spoke among themselves, it was in low murmurs, their language carrying the rhythm of home, round vowels, soft consonants, traces of humanity that no war could erase. Even the guards, listening from afar, could sense that these were not the voices of hatred, but of longing. In that shared cold, the boundaries of nation blurred for a moment. They were not enemies, only men waiting for spring, each clinging to the fragile hope that someday they would walk again on unfrozen soil. Mornings began before the light arrived, when the skies still held the deep blue of exhaustion. Inside the barracks, men stirred from narrow bunks, their breath rising in pale clouds that caught the lantern glow. The air was a blend of wood smoke, boiled cabbage, and damp wool, the scent of endurance. Someone would stoke the iron stove, coaxing a reluctant flame to life, while others queued for the day's first ladle of thin soup. Tin cups clinked softly, a metallic chorus beneath the low murmur of conversation in two languages. Beyond the frosted windows, the world was still white and endless, the fence posts standing like dark ribs against the snow. Every day,
Trust did not arrive in grand gestures. It came quietly, almost unnoticed, in the soft murmur of daily exchange, in the unspoken rhythm of coexistence. A guard would leave an extra slice of bread on a prisoner's tin, pretending not to notice when it disappeared. A German tailor, once a craftsman in Berlin, mended a torn British sleeve with thread scavenged from an old blanket. These moments passed without ceremony, yet each carried a delicate warmth that defied the frost. Sometimes, when the camp was still, a guard and a prisoner might share a cigarette near the fence, the smoke curling between them like a truce neither dared name. They spoke little, their words scattered by breath and wind, but in the pauses lay understanding, the knowledge that suffering spoke a universal tongue. A nod, a faint smile, a shared silence became their new vocabulary. In the monotony of war, kindness had no sides. It slipped between uniforms and accents, as fragile as it was persistent. The men learned, quietly, that mercy did not need permission. Each small act, a loaf saved, a coat lent, a door left ajar against the wind, was a rebellion against hatred itself, glowing softly in the heart of winter. As December crept closer, the cold deepened until it felt like a living thing, wrapping itself around the camp with invisible hands. Frost clung to the barbed wire in delicate spirals, and the nights stretched endlessly, filled with the crackle of the stove and the occasional murmur of dreams. Yet, beneath the routine, something began to stir. A quiet restlessness, a whisper carried from bunk to bunk. Christmas was approaching. The thought moved through the prisoners like a secret flame, faint but persistent. In corners of the barracks, men began to hum familiar carols under their breath, almost afraid to give the sound life. A few fashioned crude decorations from scraps of paper, bits of cloth, and candle stubs saved from rations. The British guards noticed but said nothing. They watched the preparations unfold with a kind of solemn curiosity, unsure whether to allow hope such freedom. Rules were clear, emotions were not. As snow fell in gentle silence over the camp, anticipation thickened, not joyous, but reverent, fragile. Would they be permitted a service, a song in their own tongue? No one knew. But even in that uncertainty, something human warmed the frozen air, a hope that war had not entirely silenced grace. It began with a letter written in careful script, the ink trembling slightly on the page from the cold. The German officer, once a schoolteacher from Bremen, approached the British command tent with his cap in hand. His tone was measured, his English formal but sincere. He did not ask for luxury, only for permission, a brief Christmas service for his men, a moment to remember their families in faith beneath the endless snow. Behind him, the camp seemed to hold its breath. The British officer, Captain Reeves, listened without interruption. His face betrayed nothing, though the request unsettled him in a quiet, human way. It was not the first time Mercy had brushed against regulation, and he knew the risks. Orders were clear. Sentiment could be dangerous. Yet as the German spoke, his words carried a dignity that transcended uniform. "We ask only for a prayer," he said, "in our own language, for peace, not victory." Outside, a gust of wind rattled the canvas, and the world seemed to pause. Reeves nodded, promising to consider. As the German officer returned to the barracks, hope flickered faintly in his chest. Somewhere between policy and compassion, a decision waited, one that could thaw more than just the winter air. Inside the officers' quarters, the discussion unfolded beneath a haze of pipe smoke and the faint hiss of the stove. Papers rustled, boots scuffed the wooden floor, and the weight of a simple question pressed heavier than any battle order. Should the enemy be allowed to pray? Major Hensley leaned back, arms crossed, insisting rules were rules. Leniency could be misread as weakness. But others sat in silence, staring into their mugs, the steam rising like unspoken thoughts. They were tired men, haunted by things they could not forget, and somewhere inside that exhaustion, compassion flickered. Captain Reeves said little. He studied the frost collecting on the window pane, tracing the blurred outlines of the camp beyond. He could see the prisoners moving through the snow, slow and obedient, their heads bowed under the same gray sky. "They're soldiers," he said finally, voice low. "And it's Christmas." No one answered at first, but something shifted in the room. A shared recognition that duty could not always silence decency. The argument dissolved, not with command, but with quiet assent. The men knew what war demanded of them, yet in this one decision, they would choose something gentler. Outside, the evening deepened, carrying with it the first fragile notes of forgiveness.
The answer came at dusk, carried not by fanfare, but by the calm voice of a messenger stepping through the snow. His boots left narrow impressions leading from the officers' quarters to the German barracks. In his gloved hand, a single slip of paper bore the decision. Permission granted for a brief Christmas service under supervision at 1900 hours. No flourish, no speech. Just words that would ripple quietly through the frozen camp like warmth from a hidden fire. When the message was read aloud, a hush followed, deeper than silence. For a moment, no one moved. Then one of the older prisoners removed his cap, his lips trembling with gratitude. The British guard who had delivered the note nodded once, awkwardly, as though to disguise his own emotion. It was a small act, almost bureaucratic in its simplicity, yet it carried the weight of mercy itself. The men returned to their bunks that night with something rare flickering between them: anticipation, reverence, disbelief. Outside, the snow kept falling, soft and endless. And somewhere within that quiet, both captor and captive found themselves waiting for the same thing: a night when the war might briefly remember what peace once felt like.
The night of Christmas Eve arrived, wrapped in stillness. Snow drifted steadily, softening the hard edges of the camp, covering even the wire in a fragile shimmer. Lanterns hung from wooden posts, their light swaying in the wind, halos in the mist. The prisoners gathered quietly in the center yard, rows of men in worn coats, breath misting like ghostly incense. British guards stood along the perimeter, rifles lowered, faces half lit by the flicker of flame. No one spoke. The cold was sharp enough to bite, yet the air carried something warmer, heavier, like a shared heartbeat beneath layers of wool and fear. Then from among the Germans, a single voice rose, low, trembling, unsure. Another joined, then another, until the sound became a fragile chorus, Stille Nacht. The words flowed through the camp like light through fog, delicate and haunting. Even those who did not understand the language felt its meaning. The melody drifted upward, slipping through the wire and into the night sky, where no army claimed the stars. The guards listened, unmoving. Some looked down, others closed their eyes. The song, so tender it seemed to defy the world itself, turned the camp into a cathedral of frost and forgiveness.
As the hymn carried across the camp, the British soldiers felt something stir within them, a faint tremor of memory, of home. The melody crossed the invisible divide like a bridge made of breath and faith. It was no longer the voice of the enemy they heard, but the voice of men singing for their mothers, their children, their countrymen, and for peace. A young guard near the gate swallowed hard, his eyes fixed on the snow, his lips moving soundlessly to words he hadn't sung since childhood. Another, older and steadier, hummed beneath his breath, careful not to be heard, yet unable to remain untouched. There was no command to stay silent, no rule forbidding the moment. The war itself seemed to bow its head. Even the rifles, dark and cold against the light, looked like relics of some forgotten age. In that fragile symmetry, voices rose and met, German and English, human and human. The boundaries of uniforms and orders blurred into something simple and sacred. For a few uncounted minutes, they were no longer enemies or guards, only men, suspended in the quiet grace of understanding. The hymn ended, but its echo lingered, gentle, steady, refusing to fade. When the last note of the hymn dissolved into the night, silence settled like snow, soft, weightless, infinite. A few candles flickered in trembling hands, their flames reflected in eyes that had seen too much. The wind moved gently through the camp, carrying the faint scent of pine smoke and frost. Faces once hardened by months of fear now seemed illuminated by something fragile and wordless. Across the wire, a British soldier met the gaze of a German prisoner. No gesture passed between them, only a shared stillness, an understanding that required no translation. A candle tipped, wax spilling over gloved fingers, and the man holding it smiled faintly, almost shyly, before steadying the light again. The guards watched the glow shift and pulse, as though the entire camp breathed in rhythm with it. Snowflakes drifted down like falling ash, disappearing the moment they touched the flame. Somewhere in the distance, a bell tolled midnight, its sound floating over the frozen hills. In that moment, the camp was no longer a prison, but a place suspended outside.
Morning broke with a pale, forgiving light. The snow that had fallen through the night now shimmered like fine glass, untouched except for the winding paths of footprints that led from the barracks to the yard. The camp seemed changed, though nothing visible had altered. The fences still stood, the guards still paced, the prisoners still lined up for roll call. Yet the air felt lighter, almost reverent, as if something sacred had passed through and chosen to remain. The men moved differently that morning. British guards exchanged small nods with the prisoners, gestures too subtle to be called greetings, but too warm to be coincidence. The usual commands were spoken more softly, the routine less severe. Even the dogs, restless and sharp the day before, stood calmer now, as though they too sensed that the world had exhaled. Inside the barracks, prisoners spoke quietly over their meager breakfast, recounting the night in fragments, the music,
The snow, the faces they'd glimpsed beyond the wire. No one exaggerated, no one tried to explain it. They all seemed to know that words would fail. The memory of the hymn lingered like smoke in the air, and with it came a simple truth. Something in all of them had been restored.
That afternoon, when duties slowed and the camp slipped into its usual rhythm of waiting, several men sat down to write. The Germans wrote first, their words cramped between lines of old stationery, the ink thin and faded from reuse. They told of a night unlike any other, of candles trembling in the cold, of a hymn sung beneath enemy lights, of the strange gentleness of the British command. It was brief, one prisoner wrote, but for a moment it felt as though God had found his way back through the snow. Across the yard, a few British soldiers wrote too. Their letters were steadier in hand, but no less searching. One mentioned the sound of foreign voices singing something that made his chest ache, though he couldn't understand the words. Another simply wrote, "We let them celebrate. I think it did us all some good." None of them spoke of victory or loss, only of stillness, and how for one night the world had seemed quieter than war deserved. By dusk, the letters were sealed, marked for distant homes that might never receive them. Yet the act of writing itself carried its own peace, the reassurance that what had happened would not vanish with the thaw. That night, Captain Reeves lingered by the window of his quarters, the lamp beside him flickering low. Outside, the camp lay in stillness once more, the snow smooth and pale under the watchlights. He thought of the German officer's bowed head, of the trembling hymn, of how every man there had looked suddenly, achingly young. War had demanded so much: obedience, distance, hardness, yet all it took was a song to remind him how fragile those walls truly were.
Quiet gratitude. In his journal, he wrote a single line before pausing. To be human is to remember mercy, even when the world forgets it. He stared at the words until the ink dried, feeling both comforted and hollowed by their truth. Elsewhere in the camp, others lay awake, some on straw bunks, some behind desks, each holding the same quiet realization that compassion, once given, asks to be carried forward. The rifles, the fences, the orders, all of it would fade. But this night, this small defiance of cruelty would remain. As the lamp burned out, Reeves allowed himself one final thought before sleep took him, that perhaps the truest victory in war is not survival, but the refusal to stop feeling. Decades later, when the war was only a chapter in history books and the faces of comrades had blurred into sepia, those who had lived that night still remembered it with startling clarity. The German officer, now an old man with trembling hands, would sometimes hum Stille Nacht to his grandchildren, his voice thin but steady. When asked where he'd learned it, he would only smile and say, "In a place where kindness dared to exist." Across the channel, Captain Reeves, retired, gray, and slower in step, kept a single candle stub locked away in a drawer. It had burned in the snow that night, and he could never bring himself to throw it away.
In letters exchanged between former captors and captives, there was no talk of politics, no lingering bitterness, only gratitude. Some met again years later, not as enemies, but as men who had shared a fragile miracle. They spoke of frost and candlelight, of the hush that followed the song, and of how, in that moment, the war had seemed very far away. As time weathered their memories, the story grew softer, worn smooth by retelling. Yet even as voices faded, the feeling remained, the quiet knowledge that humanity, once awakened, does not forget how to speak. Respect, in the end, was their quiet rebellion. It did not march or shout or demand to be seen, it simply endured. In a time built on dehumanization, to look upon the enemy and still recognize a fellow soul was an act of defiance far greater than violence. The British officers had not surrendered their duty, nor had the prisoners renounced their cause, but for one night they stepped outside the machinery of hatred and remembered what it meant to belong to something older and deeper than war. To respect another's dignity, even in captivity, was to protect one's own. It was a kind of armor that no uniform could provide, forged not in authority, but in conscience. The men who chose compassion that